Our international edition today, following an indictment by U.S. Department of State and certainly through Attorney General Todd Blanchett to former president of Cuba, Raul Castro, and certainly this is linked to very many years ago when there was an altercation between the two nations that led to Cuba, which was at revolution stage at the time, led by former President Fidel Castro, where two planes were downed by what allegedly was called the liberation movement of Cuba, led by Fidel Castro, and of course we had people like Che Guevara in there, and Raul Castro, of course. And the U.S. says now they want to try Raul Castro for that action in 1966 and see that there is a closure and indeed justice delivered to American citizens that were aboard that plane, but also all the other people in there. The relationship between these two nations has not been a very easy, healthy relationship, as we may know, that draws back to the times of the revolution that brought Fidel Castro to power, and the transition creating a communist republic in there that has very close ties with the USSR. And in there, the competition all through the Cold War saw competition in there. We saw military action against Cuba by the United States of America, if you remember the Bay of Pigs invasion in that particular country. But understandably, we do know that the U.S., through its CIA and ground forces, were not successful at overthrowing the Fidel Castro government at the time. And what happens in there is sanctioning was the remaining tool they had, and Cuba has been under U.S. sanctions for a very long time, including many episodes of blockades, and the most recent one was an oil blockade that created a crisis of energy in the country. We've over the past couple of months seen complete blackouts in the different cities of Cuba, Havana, and the others. We've seen a shortage of fuel in the fuel stations, and therefore there was no public transport, very limited movements in that country, and of course almost zero economic activity, because we do know that without energy, then very little or few things can be worked on. And even more to that relationship, we remember the peak in 1966, where we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the biggest 13-day crises the world has experienced, that had the Soviet Union install nuclear capable missiles in Cuba in response to the United States having stationed its missiles in Germany, what the USSR saw as a provocation and certainly a threat to their safety. And we remember the engagements between Nikol Khrushchev and President John F. Kennedy at that level, and the agreements that led to the cessation of those hostilities that threatened the world. And at the time, it was looked at as a trigger that could have taken the world into a third World War as early at that. And we do know that the relationship since then, even with a series of agreements that were reached and a bit of asylum that was granted to many people, including, we do know that the current Secretary of State of the United States of America, Mr. Marco Rubio, is of Cuban descent, and many other leaders in the United States. It comes as a backdrop of those engagements and people who cooperated with the U.S. and after the defeat of the United States, they could apparently not stay in that country. So we continue to study the interaction between the two nations, and of course the indictment of Mr. Raul Castro, who is really in very advanced ages. He should be settling. He's already in retirement. Cuba has a new president, and of course we've seen the disagreement even with the new republic. President Trump says they want to create an overhaul in Cuba and certainly take control of key areas of management in that country, of course highlighting the influence and knowledge they have over Cuba, because they have many citizens of that country in the U.S. But is it a matter that is achievable for the U.S.? Is it a matter that is actually justifiable? We've had many complaints from across the world that indicate that the actions of United States in terms of a blockade, in terms of sanctions for the longest time immemorial against international law, and of course they do say they should be lifted as soon as possible. We saw that in the past month due to the blockade and indeed the lack of energy fuel to supply the nation, Russia came out to offer some donation of fuel to the nation, but that has since also depleted, and therefore there is more need to assist the Cuban people, not forgetting that this is a nation that for the longest in time, including through the times of the African revolutions to bring independence onto the continent, Cuba is one of the countries that contributed immensely through financial arms and indeed physical boots on ground on the African continent to fight for the liberation of many African nations. And they have also continued to support in different sectors in healthcare. We do know that even Uganda here has benefited from Cuban medical expertise physically, but also through training, and indeed there has been a series of exchange programs between Kampala and Havana. Of course, we continue to study the relationship. We do know that even recently we've had a series of visits between delegations from Cuba to Kampala and Ugandan delegations to Cuba, and the relationship is seemingly very good. But we continue to take a look at how it is going to unfold and how the relationship going forward shall be restored between the socialist nation of Cuba and the United States of America, since they are all in the Americas, in the same neighborhood, and indeed they need to work together. 80 miles between the two nations is a very short distance, and therefore there should be more room for working together than confrontations which shall not yield for the people, especially the people of Cuba that have been impoverished for a very long time, courtesy of these very extreme and adverse measures taken against their government and themselves, living in darkness, the lack of energy, the lack of trading rights, jobs, education, employment. And as they have persevered even in these trying moments, we do hope there will be better interaction, solutions, diplomatic, as opposed to the rising, of course, tensions verbally that are seemingly going to take us to a military confrontation. Of course, we've seen the U.S. accusing Cuba of harboring many drones and a bit of military hardware they say is going to be used to attack the USA. The president of Cuba says, no, we do not harbor any intentions like that, and we just want our dignity and sovereignty respected as a nation. Hopefully, there can be a roundtable meeting. We saw Mr. Burns, the head of the CIA, visited Havana a few days ago to have a conversation with the leadership, and we do hope there will be an agreement reached so that there is a peaceful resolution to the challenges, so that peace can be restored in Cuba. That is what we have for you today from the international scene, and certainly stay with us here because we shall keep updating you on developments in Cuba and how the relationship is faring.